Hey, I'm going to walk you through how to do fast and very basic user testing when building digital health tools. The idea is that if you can make software that health workers love to use, that then gives you the data you need. So that's me on the bottom right there. I'm part of a team of user testing experts and designers. We make software used by health workers managing millions of patients. So we partner with organizations like WHO, DHIS2, OpenSRP, World Diabetes Foundation to improve their digital software. We also partner with health ministries in countries like India, Zambia, Bangladesh, Ethiopia to improve their digital solutions. So, a core focus of our work is on helping partners understand their users better and then using that understanding to make simple, easy to use products. So, most software that health workers are asked to use is too difficult. It was designed by bureaucrats and technology teams and experts, but without enough input from the people who'll actually use it in busy hospitals. But we all start with the same goal. We want to make this great software that's going to contribute to improving quality of life. And the general logic of how that works is that we gather a group of experts, they build this great digital solution, we train health workers on how to use the software, and then they start entering accurate data. And our program manager can look at a dashboard and decide on the next health intervention. And so the program improves. But realistically, when we go into a country and we talk to health officials or program managers, they paint a very different picture. uh, Usually the training takes very long and the process of training usually never stops. And now, because the software is not easy to use, health workers are either not using it at all or they are entering a lot of inaccurate data into the software. You can kind of guess the negative consequences something like this can have. Whether it's for a patient who needs to get their medicine on time, or if it's for a health program manager who needs to look at a dashboard and take the right next decision. This is an example from a nutrition program that we worked on. So, health workers that we talked to were not understanding some of the language used in the form. You can see a question highlighted that says anthropometric measurements done. So some of the users we talked to were skipping this field, and a few others were taking a gut call and entering inaccurate information into the field. And now, when we sit with the health ministry and look at dashboards, we can see why their jobs are so difficult because either they have unreliable data or there's not enough data to make the right decision. But what if we didn't have to wait till the end to learn? What if we could learn a lot sooner? So instead of building out the whole software in one go, we do small user tests with actual users every month. And these user tests are meant to tell us if we are on the right track, if the software is easy to use, if health workers are entering accurate information. And now every month we are able to take this learning to continue improving the software in the right direction. So, of course, when you eventually launch, you've digitized the health program and you've made the software easy to use. These are essential parts. But the main outcome is that now you've launched something that can improve health outcomes. I'm going to walk you through what I mean by a user test with an example. So, last year, we made a software to help health workers call overdue patients. And we wanted one health worker to be able to call at least 50 patients in one day. You can see on your screen that the first screen is the home screen where users can search or enroll a new patient. The middle screen is the overdue list. And the third screen is where health workers can mark the response of a call after they called a patient. So we took these designs and made a prototype that we then took to a facility where we talked to health workers who are very similar to the people who will actually end up using the software. We talked to five users, but we talked to them one at a time. And the idea of talking to them one at a time is that one, we want to create a judgment free zone where it's okay to give open feedback. And two, we want unbiased feedback. So usually when a colleague is sitting with you, you tend to be influenced by what they say or do. So we want users to be able to figure things out on their own. So we give this prototype to a user and we ask them to try making phone calls. We don't ask them if they like the design. Instead, we ask them to make phone calls and then we observe what they do. And we ask them to talk out loud about what they're thinking. When we talk to five users, some common patterns or problems stood out. The first one is that when health workers are calling a list of overdue patients, they forget who they have already called. The list doesn't give them a clear sense of whether it's reducing or if it's changing after every call. And the second problem is that when there is a big list of overdue patients, the health worker prefers to prioritize and call specific patients first. So, this was very difficult to do when it's like a big list of overdue patients. The designs that you see now are a result of solving for these repeated patterns of confusion or frustration. You can see on the third screen that now the overdue patients are categorized. So after every phone call, the health worker can see that the patient has been moved to a relevant section. So it says agree to visit or remind to call later. Uh, in the second screen, you can see that there is an option to search and find specific patients. That means when there is a big overdue list, the health worker can just search for the patient they want and make a phone call. This is the result of a single test that we did, but a lot of the changes were a result of a repeated cycle of testing. And this is data from one of our partners who actually implemented the feature. You can see that around May, June, the number of overdue patients really starts to peak at around 70%. And this means that 70% of hypertensive patients are not coming back to collect their medication. Uh, Around July, the partner implemented the calling feature, and within a month, we saw 48 of overdue patients coming back to care. You can see the programmatic impact that this regular cycle of user testing had. You can do user testing with every digital product. Essentially, we are talking to five users every month to collect these bits and pieces of qualitative information that we then use to improve the product. And you can do it at any stage of the product, whether you are at a very early stage and it's still a concept, or whether you already have a solution out there and you're just looking to improve it. But with every user test, there are a few important goals that we have to keep in mind. As a health expert or a program manager, you probably already understand the clinical terminology or the treatment workflow. But we are doing a user test to understand the day to day reality of a health worker. What does a nurse's day look like at a busy clinic? How are they using your app? Where are they getting stuck? In a lot of clinics, I have seen health staff behave more like data entry operators because of the workload. In the comic above, it's a scene from a busy clinic where a nurse is asking the patient to take their meds every day. But because of the time limitation, they're trying to quickly note down the BP reading and ends up writing a rounded BP value into a register. And this is not an unrealistic scenario. This is something that we have observed in hypertension clinics, busy hypertension clinics in multiple countries, and something that we had to solve for when designing solutions. So, part of our goal is to see through the eyes of a user and see what their challenges are. Which leads us to our second reason. When you observe people use your software, you're bound to see unexpected behaviors and people getting stuck in places that you never expected. Part of the goal of a user test is to dig into these behaviors and to understand why it happened. For example, last year in a user test that we did, we wanted health workers to be able to create a list of overdue patients. And to do that, they had to tap a button that said filters, add the dates for the month, and then click on apply to get that monthly overdue list. So after talking to a few users, nobody was tapping on that filters button. So I asked a participant, so what do you understand from this button? The user looks at the button, reads out the word filters, looks back at me, and says, I've used filters in Instagram to make my photos prettier, but I don't know what it's doing in a medical app. This was definitely unexpected for me, but now we know that using a button that says filters might not be the best way to create an overdue list. This is a small example, but we are generally trying to dig deeper into these user behaviors and any pain points that we observe. One thing we are not there to do is to ask for solutions. In the comic above, you can see that the interviewer is asking the health worker where they want the appointment scheduler in the app. This is not a good idea. The problem with a question like that is that it assumes that users have rationally analyzed whatever they did on the app. And usually, users and all of us alike are going with a gut call on what feels right to do next. So, if you ask a question like that, you're going to get an answer that addresses a surface symptom and not really the underlying usability issue. In the case of the appointment scheduler, you'll probably get an answer around, oh, I want a big appointment scheduler button. But the problem might be a larger issue with your app navigation. So instead of asking for solutions, you're there to observe behaviors and understand pain points. And now you have unbiased feedback that you can then use to create solutions. All right. So, how do we uncover these insights in a structured way? You can do it by asking two types of questions. The first type are your usability questions, which tell you how easy or difficult it is to do something in your software. And the second are your discovery questions. These are meant to help you create more context around the user's needs and their problems. With your usability questions, you can again spread them into three types, like questions that tell you if users can find something. If they find it, can they understand it? And if they understand it, can they use it? Let's take the same example of the appointment scheduler. So, can users navigate your app to find where the appointment scheduler is? And now, if they can find it, can they understand the words used to describe it? Do they understand the purpose of the appointment scheduler? Now, if they found it and if they understand its purpose, can they do the steps necessary to use it to schedule an appointment? So that's sort of what we are trying to uncover with usability questions. But sometimes you're bound to see users getting stuck somewhere or doing these unexpected behaviors. Your discovery questions are meant to help you dig deeper into those behaviors. So you ask, why did you do that? Or how often do you do something? Or what were you expecting to see? These are open ended questions that get people to share their experiences. So, your questions are part of a larger user test. And generally, we can plan a user test in five parts. The first is identifying the key questions that you want to answer with the user test. The second is creating the prototypes that test participants will use. The third is finding the right people to talk to. Fourth is structuring the interview. You're going to spend 1 hour talking to each participant. Now, how do you structure that 1 hour? The fifth is analyzing the insights from the interviews, deciding on what the top action items are, and sharing learnings with stakeholders. We'll do a small exercise to identify few user testing questions, but before we dive into that, I want to take you through another example. This is from a nutrition program that we worked on. It was COVID, and some parts of the country was facing an acute food shortage. So the health ministry decided to act by setting up a monitoring and treatment program for malnourished children. So, a group of experts in child nutrition and in software, they get together in this conference room and build an excellent digital program. But unlike the nice, cool conference room, the software is meant to be used in a more hot and humid environment. And sometimes these places don't have regular internet or electricity. You can already start getting a glimpse of a gap. And the closer we get to actual users, the more significant this gap. Usually, people have this picture of a perfect clinical workflow. And then we go into a field and we see that things are usually very different and sometimes messy. We went into the field to understand what gaps existed for the nutrition program and how we can improve the software. Every user test is meant to answer specific questions. So we always start with 3 to 5 questions that we want to answer through the test. In this case, we worked with the nutrition experts to pin down 3 things that had to go well, and we frame them as questions. So, first one is, do health workers understand the child enrollment and treatment form fields? Second, is it easy to enter accurate data? Third, is the app easy to use during clinical care? But we can't directly ask these questions. So we create tasks and think of tasks as nudges. They're meant to encourage health workers or users to use the app in certain ways that lets us observe the answers to our questions. So, in this case, our question was, do health workers understand the enrollment and treatment form fields? So, the task that we would ask them to do is to enroll a new child into the program. uh, we'd ask a user to add treatment details for a newly enrolled child. We also ask them to enter follow up details for a child undergoing treatment. And when we observe 5, 6 people doing these tasks, some very clear patterns start to emerge. Some of our top learnings are on the screen here. The first one I showed previously also is that users landing on the treatment form, they didn't understand what anthropometric measurements meant. The second thing we learned is that when diagnosing a child for malnutrition, every gram or centimeter matters. So the app wasn't currently allowing health workers to enter decimal values, and this was causing some misdiagnosis. The health workers were also using age and weight values to plot a graph, which they then use for diagnosis. So you can see the graph here where age and weight are plotted, and the diagnosis line is very close to red. This is a very stressful situation for the health worker, and now they have to take a gut call on what the diagnosis is. But now that we see these problems and we know that they're important, we are able to use these insights to improve the software. So we changed the wording, we accepted decimal values for height and weight. We even removed the need to manually plot age and weight on a paper graph. That's a digital graph that you can see on the right. All right, so you saw how we framed questions for the nutrition program. Now, imagine that you are working on a digital health solution and you want to improve it. Take 2 minutes and write down 3 things that you want to learn, framed as questions. I've put a few examples you can use on the screen in case you're not working on something right now. Like examples like, do users understand the input fields used in the enrollment and treatment forms? Are users able to easily enroll new patients into the nutrition program? What is the average time taken by users to add a patient? Especially when building software for busy clinics, average time to enroll or add a patient visit becomes very important. Last one is, which language do users prefer to use the app in? So feel free to pause the video and write down 3 questions that you want to answer. All right, so you have the questions that you want answers to. But remember that users don't have good memories. If I ask you what you had for breakfast 5 days ago, you probably won't be able to tell me. Similarly, if you ask these questions to a user, it's very difficult for them to give realistic answers. So you want to create prototypes that you can then give to your test participants and they can touch and feel and use it, and then you can observe what they do on your solution. If you're at a very early stage of your solution, it's absolutely fine to take a paper form into the user test. For example, that lets you figure out how users understand the language used in the form. It also lets you see how users gather the data necessary to fill in the form. But if you already have a solution in mind, I would definitely recommend making a quick prototype with a software like Figma and then taking that into the user test. Just to show you how easy it is to make a Figma prototype, I'm going to quickly jump into Figma now and create a quick prototype. So imagine I want to run a user test for a new hypertension program. So I want to test out the enrollment form and the patient visit form. First thing I'll do is I'll create a new page. I'll name it hypertension user test. All right. I'll create a new artboard. So I'll go to the right and select Android large. So a UI library has a whole bunch of components that you can use to create your prototype. So in this case, I want a top bar, which I can search for and find. I'll just resize it, delete anything I don't need, name it hypertension enrollment. Now I want my forms. So they're called text fields. I'll drag and drop a text field, resize them. On the right, I can change a few things to make them look a little better. Okay, great. I don't want this input field. I want a label. This is where I'll add first name, last name, address, things like that. I'll create a few versions of this. I can keep going. But at the bottom, I want a button that users can tap to enroll the patient. So I'll just search for button on the left, find a button. I'll resize it, name it enroll patient. So you can already start seeing how it's shaping up, but I want the visit form now. Oops, great. And I'll probably name this BP systolic, can name this BP diastolic. I'll name this medicines. I don't have anything to put here. Maybe I can call it other medicines and make it a free text field. And I'll add visit here. Right. This is in no ways a perfect form, but you can already see how easy it is to quickly create a prototype if you have a solution in mind. But you want this to be a working prototype. That means that users can tap into the different screens. So when they tap into enroll, I want them to move to the hypertension visit screen, and I want them to move back. So first, I'm going to change this icon with a back icon. Perfect. Now I can tap on enroll, go into prototype in the right, and drag this plus icon and connect it to the screen. And now I can tap on this back button, click on the plus button, and connect it back to the first screen. So now I can go into the prototyping mode where this is sort of like a preview of the prototype. Yeah, and now this almost looks like a real phone. This looks like my hypertension enrollment form. I can tap on enroll, move into the hypertension visit, and tap on add visit. That was in no way an ideal prototype. I just wanted to give you a sense of how easy it is to create a quick prototype once you have a solution in mind. All right, so you have your questions and you have the prototype. Now, who do we talk to? A good rule of thumb is to talk to 5 people. This is a graph from a Jacob Nielsen study that shows that 80% of your insights come from talking to 5 people, and then you start seeing the same patterns again and again. So remember that our goal is to not to uncover a whole bunch of problems. It's to uncover just enough problems that we can fix to keep improving the software. When selecting participants, you don't want to talk to just any random person. You want participants that are a representative sample of the people who'll actually use your software. So, if I'm making a software for busy hypertension clinics, I'll want to talk to health staff with experience managing hypertension patients. But then again, don't get too hung up on finding the perfect participants. When we were making software for busy hypertension clinics, we didn't always have access to those users. So we would hire participants from private clinics where the patient load isn't that high, and that would still give us really good results. The closer you are to your solution, you'll want to test with users who are going to use your software. If I talk to a nurse from a private clinic, a lot of insights around language and how they understand the software might come out. But if I talk to a nurse from a busy hypertension clinic, a lot more challenges around time management are going to come out. But other than finding a representative sample, we keep our qualifying criteria very basic. If you're testing a smartphone app, you want somebody with some experience using an Android or Apple phone. Uh, Generally, we are making software to be used in clinics. We want somebody who has experience interacting with patients. And if you are talking to five participants, you don't want all five of them to have an advanced degree, because they're going to pick up on patterns a lot quicker and you are going to end up biasing some of your results. This is a list of sources that you can reach out to find participants. Like if you're working with government partners or stakeholders, then you can leverage those connections to find participants to talk to. Or if you have personal contacts or networks in hospital, you can use that. If these sources are not available, there are private vendors who can get you participants, only that it's going to cost you a lot more. In case none of these options work for you, you always have the option to go up to somebody at a coffee shop near a hospital and ask them if you can have 30 minutes of their time. So if they are a health staff, then that's also a great audience that you can talk to. 1 hour with five participants once a month. That's a general rule that we follow. So you can conduct a test on Monday and have the final report ready by Friday. When you're scheduling your sessions, make sure you put 30-minute buffer after each session so you get time to breathe and reflect on what you learned. When you're choosing a venue, you don't want anything too fancy. If you're at a clinic, of course, ask for a space where you won't be disturbed during the duration of a study. But if you're doing the test somewhere outside, it's always better to go with the boring option. In this image, the image on the left is clearly the most boring option. This is from a test we did a couple of months back. The advantage of a boring choice is that it lets your participants think of this as a friendly conversation rather than some official review of how good they're at their job. So much of a good user test is about making participants feel comfortable, being empathetic, so they can open up about their experiences without feeling judged. All right, so make sure you get to the venue well in advance of the participant so you have time to set everything up, like your laptops, prototypes, any Google Meet or Zoom links that you want to share with observers. So set all of that up ahead of time. Generally, it's not a good idea to have more than three people in a space. That's going to get crowded and it's going to add to the stress of your participants. The image on the left is sort of an ideal situation where you have the interviewer and the participant and the translator, and they have the whole place to themselves. But you're not always going to get an ideal situation. On the right, we all had to pack ourselves into this small office room. That's me on the back taking notes. But you'll still notice that the participant is facing away from everybody else and only seeing the interviewer. This goes a long way to making them feel at ease. Sometimes you're going to get stakeholders asking if they can ask questions or sit in for the interview. But every time when we tell them politely that this might bias the participants, they're absolutely okay with staying outside and maybe observing through a Google link. This is my screen from the same study, and it's a good example of what an observer sees. So, on the left is the phone screen shared by the participant, and on the right is the Google Doc where I'm taking notes. All right, now for the actual 1 hour interview with the test participant. This interview arc concept is from Michael Margolis. He breaks down the 1 hour interview into five parts based on the level of engagement at each point. So, your interview starts at a low point of engagement as you're just getting familiar with each other. It reaches this high point somewhere around the 40-30 minute mark. This is where you both trust each other and you're also learning a ton. And then it sort of winds down towards the end and you wrap up and reflect on what you learned. The first part of your interview is the meet and greet. Like if you meet a longtime friend, you don't directly dive into a deep conversation. You make small talk, you ask about the weather. So it's okay to spend a few minutes making general small talk. Greet the participant and follow that up by introducing yourself and the team. Communicate the purpose of the interview very briefly and get the participants' written consent to record and use the interview. So, generally, what I will say is, hey, I'm Tony. This is my colleague Chetan. We are part of a team that builds software used in hospitals. We're trying to get your feedback on a few designs our team has come up with. Before we start, do you mind signing a consent form? Please take your time to read through it and then sign it. So it's really important that your participants understand what's happening, who will read their comments, who will see their feedback, and how will the video be used later. It's important for you to clarify that. So after you give the consent form, give them a couple of minutes to read through and sign it. The second part is where you set some broad expectations around the study. Let the participant know that you are only testing the software and not them. Encourage them to think out loud while they're using the app. Sometimes participants get caught up in their own worlds and forget to share what they're thinking. So it's important to keep reinforcing that it's better that they think out loud. Even if I made the designs, I tell participants that I didn't make it, so they are not worried about hurting my feelings when giving feedback. Let them know that it's okay to ask questions, but that you might not be able to answer them because you're trying to see what they would do on their own if they did not have anybody to help them. Part three is where you get a sense for the day to day life of a participant outside the software. On one hand, it helps you develop trust with the participant, but it also lets you see how your software will fit into their life. And it helps to keep the conversation specific here. Like if you ask the participant what they do, they might say, oh, I work in the ICU, it's a big hospital. The conversation might veer off into these tangents which won't add to the study. But you want to try to ask specific questions like, can you describe what your day was like yesterday? Or can you describe the step by step actions that you take to do something? Or do you record data anytime during your day? Can you show me how you do that? So, in about 10 minutes, you start getting a much better picture of what the participant's life is like. I'll link out to more warm up questions you can use depending on your user test. Now we'll move into specific tasks we want participants to do on your software or your prototype. So while they're doing the task, we'll observe them, ask questions, and gather feedback. Take a look at the questions you created earlier, and we'll think about how to convert them into tasks. So I'm taking a sample question. Is it easy to find and understand patient history during clinical care? And that's the question I want an answer to. If I can observe five people trying to find a data point inside patient history, I'll get my answer. But then it's very hard for a participant to relate to this task. Data point is something that the ministry or technology people use. It's not something very relevant to a health worker. So I want to relate the task to something that the participant does in their day to day life. So I'll create a scenario, and the scenario is what I will share with the participant. In this case, imagine that a mother brings her child to your facility for a regular checkup, as she was instructed to. Her child's name is Jasandi Jagoda. The mother's name is Manjula. Can you find out this child's weight in her last visit? So now, instead of trying to find a data point, the participant is trying to find the child's weight, which is something they're used to doing on a daily basis. In this case, for the participant to find the child's weight, they would have to tap on search for Jasandi Jagoda, open up the patient's record, scroll down a bit, tap on the history section, scroll down a bit, and see the weight. And now, as I observe users trying to go through these steps, I'll either notice that they complete the steps successfully, which is great. We know that the software is usable, or I'll notice that they get stuck somewhere. Like, for example, if they reach the patient page and can't figure out what to tap to reach the patient history, this is a good opportunity for me to dig deeper to understand what is going wrong. So, I'll probably follow up with a question like, what do you understand from this page? Or can you walk me through this page? And in situations like this, silence is really powerful. Sometimes I'll ask a question and there will be this awkward pause. And so my natural instinct is to fill up the pause with more clarification. But instead, if I just stay silent and look up at the participant expectantly, they will see that as a cue to try to figure things out and try to answer me. But instead, if I clarify myself and say, do you see that assessment and assistance section? What do you understand from this section? I'm redirecting their attention to a section which they will guess is probably where they need to find patient history. And so I lose out on a lot of understanding about the screen. So a lot of your insights are hidden behind this silence. So it's useful to intentionally stay silent after you ask a question. You'll also notice that I did not mention any of the words used in the app. If you do that, the participant is probably going to hunt down those specific words and try to take an action there. So, when you're creating a scenario, try to keep it generic, more realistic, and avoid words used in the application. This is a useful list of do's and don'ts when observing participants do test tasks. One is to not ask leading questions. For example, don't ask a participant if they like a design or if they will tap on a specific button. Instead, ask open ended questions. Ask them what is going through your mind or what do you expect to see there. When participants get stuck, sometimes it's natural that they'll ask you what to do next. So instead of replying, try to get them to think about it themselves. You can frame it by asking, what do you think? Generally, you're bound to notice interesting behaviors while participants do a task, but try to hold back till the participant completes the task or you're sure the participant fails at the task and then follow up with your question. For example, you can say, I saw you did dash. What was going through your mind when you did it? So, once your tasks are done and your follow up questions are done, it's time to slowly wind down the interview. This is when you'll send out signals to your participants to let them know that you don't have any more questions for them. So, you tell them that this has been really helpful. Ask them if they have any final comments for you. It's also useful to summarize a few things that you have learned. So participants get a chance to jog their memory and tell you if they think of something else. And then at the end, you can hand them their incentive or money and thank them for their time. You can see that the interview arc has now come back all the way down. After talking to 5 participants, it's time to reflect on what you learned and decide on what the top problems are that you want to fix. These are notes from a user test that we did. On the x-axis, you can see all the participants, and on the y-axis, you can see the different tasks that we asked participants to do. So these were written down by an observer who was with me during a study. But if you don't have an observer, you can also take down notes yourself right after an interview is over. So use the 30 minutes right after an interview to take down notes. Again, you have to remember that it's not so important if one user gave you feedback. What we are really looking for is these repeated patterns where multiple users give the same feedback. And those problems are where we want to focus most of the team's effort on. These interview notes are going to give you enough clarity to share an executive summary with your team on the day of the interview. But I'll also link out to a detailed report which has more insights, which you can share at the end of the week after reviewing the recordings. Hopefully, this has given you a good set of resources to plan and conduct a user test. If you're working on a digital health solution, the best next step is to use the video and the associated worksheets to plan a user test in the next 2 to 3 weeks. If you made it this far in the video, you're probably the right person to plan and conduct that test. If you need any support, you can always reach out to me. I'll link out to all the resources you need to plan a test here. Thank you and good luck making software that health workers love to use.